right, in this panel, we celebrate the legacy of the legendary pioneering keyboardist, synthesist, and composer Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. As we near the 10th anniversary of his passing, our panel will explore Keith's musical beginnings, his use of the Moog. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm a guitar player. What do you want? Modular synthesizer in the studio and on tour. You guys are harsh. This relationship with Bob Moog. You guys just help me out. Anytime I come to it, you're gonna say it for me, okay? His passion for composing, the creation of the Keith Emerson modular reissue, and his enduring legacy. To moderate this esteemed panel, please welcome Executive Director of the Bob Moog Foundation, Michelle Moog-Koussa.
That was awesome. Yes. I think our job here is done, actually. As long as we've got that established, we can all go home now. You have no idea how much of my life I've spent gently correcting people. So, welcome everybody. As Tiffany mentioned, I'm Michelle Moog-Koussa. I'm the Executive Director of the Bob Moog Foundation and the Museum, and it is my honor to be here today with all of you and with this incredible panel representing the legacy of the extraordinary, talented Keith Emerson. I will just quickly introduce who is here with me. I have Steve Porcaro here to my left. Next to Steve is Brian Kehew. Next to Brian is Rich Walborn. Next to Rich is Rachel Flowers. And last but certainly not least, on the end there is the wonderful Mari Kawaguchi. So I would like to start out with a question for each one of the panelists. And I'll start with you, Steve. How would you describe Keith Emerson's legacy?
Keith was singular. He's truly a singular artist. His legacy is that he set the bar for all of us who wanted to explore sound, were musos at heart, and knew how to put on a show, you know?
I think he's one of the most inspiring musicians I've ever seen, the kind of person that makes you want to play an instrument, and that's a very important impact on a lot of us.
I don't know. That's okay, you can skip. We're gonna get a lot more out of you later, don't worry. Rachel, what about you?
I think that he was one of the, how to describe it? He was one of the few musicians that combined classical music and jazz and rock simultaneously, and just not being afraid to explore all kinds of music throughout his discography.
Lovely. Mari?
Hello? Okay. Yeah, he was the funniest musician ever lived. That's for sure. I think people here, there's a really good friends of Keith, all of them, so they know how he was, how funny he was.
Nice to get that non-musician perspective, yes. So I'd like to start off with Rich, because Rich actually knew Keith Emerson before any of us. Rich, would you fill people in about what your position was in the company that you were working for that led you to eventually work with Keith?
Well, I was working at Moog, and back in 1972, Moog had me fly down to Louisville, where I think I installed replaced the original 901 oscillators with the 921s. And so anyhow, so I was working at Moog, and about November, just around the brain solid surgery tour, they asked me, hey, do you want to go on tour with Emerson like a Palmer? I go, yeah, sure, why not? So I flew down to Miami for rehearsals, and basically I spent about 5 months with Keith. Traveled with the band, at least the first half of the tour. I had a seat on the private jet. It was very interesting.
So fill them in. So Rich was an engineer for Moog Music, and fill them in what you were taking care of for Keith.
Well, Keith, on brain cell surgery, he used a prototype of the Polymoog and the Apollo, which were prototypes, and he decided to take them on tour. And of course, he also had the big modular Moog. So that was my job. And it was the easiest job in the world, primarily. I didn't have to hump gear, I didn't have to set up anything, I just had to make sure it worked.
So tell us a little bit about your adventures with maintaining the Monster Moog in particular, the big modular.
Yeah, for the most part, the big Moog worked well all the time, except for, I remember, Jacksonville, Florida. The Civic Center was right next to a television and radio transmitter, and we got there for sound check. Hit a note on the keyboard, waved your hand across the front panel, it would detune the whole Moog. And Keith was freaking out. He was ready to pull the gig. And I go, well, let's not be too hasty. Give me 7 rolls of aluminum foil. And I wrapped the entire Moog in aluminum foil. It looked like a Thanksgiving turkey. But it was playable. And then that happened the second time in maybe South Carolina, same thing. But other than that, it was pretty reliable. But yeah, Keith kind of threw a fit, but.
Well, it was an important part of the setup.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to lose one of your voices, so to speak. So I understand that you have like a story or reflection about the noise level where on stage where Keith was.
Oh yeah. Keith's Moog monitor was a Altec W bin with a multi-cellular horn that blasted through the Moog. Somebody brought an SPL meter, and when Keith played it, it registered 146 dB. I wore pistol ear protectors on stage. I couldn't stand it. I got caught in between that and the Moog one time when he started playing. I thought I was going to puke.
And is there a ribbon controller story you want to share?
Yeah. Moog made a ribbon controller, which is kind of a linear keyboard. It's basically, you can do slide, it had a steel strip with Teflon tape on it, and you could basically do continuous tones. Well, over time, the Teflon tape wore off. And so it was just bare metal. And what Keith figured out, if he took his thumb, pressed on the ribbon, and touched the trigger bar, he could make a machine gun sound. And he'd go, and that's what he did on stage. But we did run into one slight problem. He had little tubes with flash powder and flash paper in them, where he could ignite and shoot flash paper out over the crowd. We're at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. And this was 30 minutes into the show. Rocky the roadie stuffed in way too much flash powder. And the tube came back and took off Keith's thumb. Nail. Ripped it right off. And my comment was, don't bleed on the Moog. But he finished the gig. We don't know how. I know how. Kawaguchi. He was loaded by the time the gig was done.
So Steve and Brian, and we'll start with Steve. What was it about Keith's playing that differentiated him from his contemporary keyboard players?
It just was his combination, his knowledge, like Mari was saying, of classical music and jazz. He could really do it all. He really could combine it all. And you know, what I took away from, I remember at 1971 when I first heard him play live, and my mind was blown, and I wanted to be Keith Emerson. What it evolved to was just wanting to be unique, separate myself from everyone else in my own way, the way Keith did. I was never going to be a Keith Emerson. No one is. No one has ever come close, as we all know. It was just to be the best version of yourself you could be, like I think, like he was to me. He just was untouched.
Brian?
When I think about him, there are so many, especially in the 1970s, great and amazing players that we know about. But when I think of the other famous ones like Rick Wakeman or Chick Corea or Herbie Hancock, play their music well. It's Herbie Hancock plays jazz on a synthesizer, so does Chick Corea. Rick Wakeman plays some classical music and some pop lines and so forth, but Keith played every range of things. Instead of just playing notes and solos, he also explored the experimental and weird sounds, you know, programming sounds that were really out there, and then finding musical ways to use that. Whereas the other people, and they're wonderful players, but they could easily push, you know, a preset on number 5 and play a solo and it would sound good. But he was actually making his own sounds in his own ways, if you know songs like Hoedown or Toccata or pieces like that, where he's creating sounds that other synthesists have not done before. So I thought it was very inspiring to see him using the synthesizer as the next level of things. He wasn't just playing a Hammond organ only or a piano. He was stepping into what a synthesizer could take you into, which was new sounds.
Keith brought a Moog on the road with him, and not just the portable version of a modular Moog. He brought the console version. He didn't do that. Those were for universities and sound studios.
Yeah, he was on his mind.
You know, you had to be. And what it took then to interface those things and to make them work and to go from different presets. It took his relationship with Bob was hugely important. I know. I knew back then to pull that stuff off. And it just, as one of the fans out there, it just was mind-blowing hearing that stuff cranked out of a huge sound system. It was just, it was mind-blowing, and it was life-changing for me.
I think also Mari, because she mentioned his sense of humor, and I was going to put it mildly that he was a funny fucker. He was always joking, but the music is very serious, but he doesn't mind joking too. He'll play funny sounds. He would take that ribbon controller and wipe his butt with it and blow things up and kick things over on stage. There's a perfect example, that photograph, look at that. While things were 90% very serious, most people treat themselves as so serious, but I think he also didn't mind having a laugh on stage at his own expense.
He didn't take himself seriously, you know. It was always, every day was just filled with laughter with him.
Rachel, do you have any perspective on what made Keith Emerson different from his contemporary keyboardists?
Yeah, so it's interesting, we were talking about Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea and all those, they were experts on, they were like the jazz performers, and then you had the classical driven players like Rick Wakeman and Tony Banks from Genesis, but then Keith was like, well, here's what I love about Bach, and he would say, now you could combine classical and the jazz music of people like Thelonious Monk and Jimmy Smith all in the same sentence. It's like you don't have to be just a classical musician or just a jazz musician. You could combine all those different sounds together. And what else? Well, I've been listening a lot to the recordings that Keith did when he was in the Nice, which was the bands that came before ELP, and that band's, the recordings don't have any Moog synthesizers, but I heard a story that Keith started experimenting with the Moog right when the Nice were splitting up, and why Keith came up with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But a lot of those recordings with the Nice, especially the stuff from 1969, they would take a Bob Dylan song, and then Keith would say, okay, here's a Bach piece from the Well-Tempered Clavier, and he was doing mashups before mashups were a thing in that world, so it was like, hey, check this out, Bob Dylan, here's Bach. And I was like, wow, if they could do that, that would be really cool. So, thank you.
Steve, when did you said you became a fan of Keith Emerson in 1971. When did you first meet him?
I think Mark Bonilla first introduced us. I believe we'd spoken a couple times on the phone for different reasons. He was when MIDI first came out. I had a great relationship with Yamaha at the time, and he had reached out to me. Anyway, but I think it was Mark Bonilla. Mark had been working with him a lot, and we got together with Mark, and we actually listened to some music one time, and then Mark actually invited me to, they were doing some synthesizer, some Moog, actually on something that they were working on together, and invited me down.
And what was that like to meet him, both from a musician standpoint and from a personal standpoint?
On both levels, I was just having a lot of trouble not humping his leg. But I held it together.
I understand.
No, you're always warned. I was always warned about meeting my heroes, because it's when you really idolize someone, whether it's the lyrics they wrote or the music they made, and when you meet them and they're not, maybe they're in a bad mood, whatever the reason is, they're not where you picture them being. It can really be heartbreaking. And Keith, every time, was just a sweetheart, just the nicest guy, and so giving. And believe me, I was full of myself at different times in my life. But meeting him, he was always just as nice as I could ever wish him.
And I'm curious, did the presence of the Monster Moog on stage then inspire you to build your own massive modular system?
Well, yeah, I wanted to be like Keith, but I wound up, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea how these things worked. It was a quick education, and I learned very fast to make friends, to find my humility and make friends with people who knew. People like Brian, a lot of friends that taught me a lot. It was by me just asking a lot of questions and wanting to use it in a musical way, in a very musical way, and with the ideas I had in my head. And try to be, again, just the best version of myself using that stuff. using a synth like that. I would hear it and I would get all these ideas of what was possible.
Inspiration.
And then it's hard actually pulling it off. You need a lot of people with a lot of know-how, a lot more than I had. I knew nothing about electronics or about synthesizers for that matter. But I wanted to, you know.
Rachel, can you tell us about the first time that you met Keith and what kind of led to that?
Oh, I don't really remember a lot of it now. It was too short. It was too short. Because when I would hear stories about Keith, and I would listen to interviews and recognize his voice when he would talk about playing with an orchestra. We would play with an orchestra. And so like when I heard Keith talk, I was like, okay, that's Keith's voice, and I would imitate it just so I could instantly recognize it. It's like, hello Rachel, it's Keith Emerson here. So I'm working on a Doors tribute album, and recording When You're Strange, or something like that. But we met at a restaurant in, what year was that? 2014? Yeah. It's not there anymore, I don't think. Yeah. I'm bummed out because it was a really nice restaurant, and he was conducting with an orchestra, and they were playing material from his last album, the one with the orchestra that he talked about. And he said that he was working on a Doors tribute album, and we started talking. There was this jazz music coming from the speakers in the backgrounds, and I'm guessing it was either Ella Fitzgerald or Sarah Vaughan. It's like, and at the time, I was like, yeah, I'm listening to a lot of current singers right now, like Esperanza and Gretchen Parlato and Keith. I can't remember the exact words that Keith said, but he was like, you know, vibratos, it's too fast, or something like that. He was like, the vibrato it was way over the top, and I was like, yeah, the vibrato is really fast. That style of jazz singing from the 1950s, and this is before I started really diving into Sarah Vaughan, and now I've become like a huge fan of that early jazz vocal stuff, like Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Frank Sinatra. But at the time, I was like, yeah, okay. And Keith and I were very similar, and yeah, it was too short because it felt like we were just about to know each other. Yeah.
Rachel, I do remember when Keith was working on the record before he met you. It was this young girl from California who, I think he was your favorite composer, right? You know a lot of music, but he is a person she had learned almost to play almost every one of his songs and records, note for note, perfectly. And he was so amazed that a young girl who was not born when he was out playing the major part of his life had already learned all of this great music and could play it as well as anybody has ever done. He was so impressed by that.
How old were you when you met him?
Oh boy. Is it?
14?
Is he 2014, let's see, 2 minus
She was like
20.
early teen, yeah. But I was so impressed because at the time restaurant in Santa Monica it was, right? There was a jazz music playing in the background between the set. And then Rachel and Keith would both say, oh, the bass is this, keyboard is this, saxophone is that. They both knew, and then I knew instantly, these two are like from the same planet. I was really impressed with that.
Me too.
Mari, tell us about how you met Keith.
Oh boy. This is back in 2006. I was working at Yale University Medical School in New Haven, and there's a place called Toll's Place. It's a famous venue. The older touring musicians started as a kind of warm-up. And 2 weeks before, I saw Carl Palmer's band, right? And I wasn't like a big fan of EOP or anything like that. And I saw the flyer that said Keith Emerson band coming in 2 weeks. I said, okay, well, maybe I'll go see it. So that's where I met him, but I didn't know who he was. He was in the darkness playing keyboard in complete darkness, and I thought Mark Bonnier was the band leader. So after the show, there's a meet and greet, and I said to Mark, your band is great. And the next person in the line for autograph was Keith, and I said, so what is your name? And everybody around me like, what? And he gave me a drink, he gave me all the merchandise to stay there so he can talk to me, and from then, we became really close. Yeah. Oh, that's Chibi-chan, by the way. I still have that same bird.
And can you tell us a little bit about Keith as a composer? Because I know that's something you and I have talked about. And I remember saying to Keith once, we were just having an informal conversation and talking about the old days, and he was regaling me with stories of being on the road, and I said something glib like, Keith, you're such a rock star. And he goes, it's not really the way I think of myself. I said, and so I wanted to know, how do you think of yourself? He said, I think of myself as a composer. And I know that was very important to him, and I wonder if you could just elaborate
Yes,
on that.
like you said, he never saw him as a rock star or even a prog musician. He was just musician, artist, and composer. And I think lots of people don't know this. He never had a formal music education. He had a local old lady piano teacher, never took any classes in composition, orchestration. He self-studied. That's his old piano teacher, and the Porter. So he really taught himself how to read music by his father's insistence. And for the composing, he never used any kind of software like a Pro Tools or anything like that. Everything was done manually, by hand. Yeah, he will have I used to draw 5 lines for him in a restaurant in a cocktail napkins. Because he will have this, I have something in my hand. Can you draw the line? And I would draw the line, and he start composing. And sometimes he would wake up in 3 in the morning. I have melody in my head, and he will be at the piano composing. And then he said that I don't know where it comes from. It's coming from somewhere up there. It's not me. It's coming from somewhere else. And that's how he was. And he never even, I don't think he even took credit as a composer in a way, because he didn't think it was him. It was some external force that's giving him this melody.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that my dad always used to say, what Bob Moog used to say, that someone asked him where he got his ideas. And he said, I don't think my ideas are my own. I believe, and he did this, that there's a network of ideas. And the ideas, I open myself up, and the ideas come through me. So it sounds like Keith had that same perspective.
Of course, please. I just want to say, speaking of his composition, I know this is a NAMM show, and it's all about the equipment most of the time, but we wouldn't even be talking about Keith like this. It wouldn't matter about customized Moogs and this and that if it wasn't for the notes this guy was playing. It was, the music just inspired me. Latches's The Three Fates on the first album, which was just solo piano, I was obsessed. And, would fantasize of being able to play like that in front of a bunch of people, especially the girl in 8th grade I had a crush on. But David Page and I used to always say that we'd look at each other, we'd listen to Keith's music, we'd listen to EOP, and we just would both say to each other, Keith's notes. His music was so heroic to us. It was we were storming the castle. It was so unboring, unboring classical music to us is what it was. And that's why we're all here, is because of how great his compositions are.
I remember, I'm trying to think of in 2016 or 2017, a Japanese orchestra recorded an all-orchestral version of the Tarkus record. And Keith brought me the CD of that, and he was so proud, because if you put it on, I think it's the best version of it I've ever heard. And I think he felt the same way, even though they were so great at playing it. And it was his piece. If he ever walked into a room and there was a piano, guess what he played? Always over and over. I think it was a favorite of his, but the fact that an orchestra in another country is playing it like you do with Beethoven or Stravinsky, without the composer there, without anybody showing off, that piece really stands out with an orchestra behind it.
Yes, at the concert in Japan, Keith was almost in tears, saying that I wish my mom can be here and see this. Because it was like a full circle. You know, he was using classical music and admire classical musicians. Now the classic musicians are admiring him and playing his music. So for him, it was like, wow, that's a full circle coming to him.
Brian, can you tell us how you met Keith?
Years ago, we were doing an exhibit for the NAMM Show people. They have a museum down in Carlsbad, the Museum of Making Music, and they're wonderful people. We still work with them on things, and we had a special exhibit all about Bob Moog and his life and his legacy. And it was our dream to invite Keith to come down and play for the opening situation. And he was based out of Santa Monica area, and I was in LA, so they asked me to come over and talk to them about what to do. And he was not going to play with a group, with a drummer, with a bass player, with a guitarist, and he was a bit worried, actually. And so we had a chat, and I told him about working a little bit with Pete Townsend, who I know, and Pete does solo shows where he just strips the songs down, improvises, changes things around. It doesn't have to be 1972. It can be whatever you want it to be. So he liked the idea of working with loopers and putting in bass lines and improvising. So that turned out to be a big success. It was a fantastic event where he came out and played for everyone, and he had a great time. And I think we just connected at that point. We got to know each other and became good friends as well, too.
We're gonna take off on these photos that Craig is pulling up for us with Keith and Jean and Brian. Brian, can you tell us a little bit how you got involved in the creation or recreation of Keith Emerson's modular, the project that Moog Music took on and eventually released 5 Keith Emerson modular reissues in 2014. How did you become involved in that?
This is on the left side of that picture is Gene Stopp. Gene is no longer with us, but he was a fantastic, brilliant guy. And he was really interested in progressive rock music. He listened to it all day long. This is literally, if you know what a mellotron is, he had 3 of them in his living room. And so this is the kind of person we're talking about. And he had actually worked on Keith's big synthesizer many years before when ELP reformed. They spent about a week trying to put it back into shape before they could go on tour. I think maybe for the best, which was a Japanese tour he did with Joe Walsh and others. But Dean came to me and we first met and he said, I really want something to do with my brain and my skills with circuits and things. And I said, Keith has the big synthesizer and it's in terrible condition. So Gene said, I will work on it, but if you can come to my house so I can do it after dinner or when I have some time. So Keith agreed to let him have it. It spent better part of a year there because it wasn't needed. Well, Gene took it apart to the ground, redid everything and made it. And then we had some ideas to work on it together to make it better and a little bit more than it was to fix things up. There they are in the living room actually working with it. And so Keith was very pleased to have someone so knowledgeable and skilled. And then Gene and I became obsessed with not just this synthesizer, but all those Moog modules are so cool. And then we decided to dream up the idea for ourselves. We wanted a big synthesizer like that. And we started to make modules from the original plans. I found the Moog engineers, and I found the circuit boards and the front panel design. So we talked to Moog Music and said, this is a thing. You could make these synthesizers again. So the picture you're seeing is what's in the Bob Moog Foundation booth today. You need to come over and see it in person. It's a 1-to-1 clone of Keith Emerson's system at that time. And so we wanted to prove that not only could they make a filter or some little module, if Moog can make this thing, the most famous synthesizer in the world, they will be making and selling Moog modules from that point on. So it was kind of a nice story because Moog leaked this information for the first time on April 1st, April Fool's Day. We put a picture up, and I remember shooting it late at night. Here's Keith's system, and here's the new one sitting next to it. And they released it in the morning saying, April 1st, Moog is making modular systems again, and we're making Keith Emerson's, and everybody laughed and laughed and laughed. And then 2 weeks later, Keith came out on stage in Asheville, North Carolina, where these guys are from, and played both of them on stage. And people went, oh, wow, it's real. I have a comment too, because when those came out, we saw a few pictures of Steve and I in the booth. Keith was there, and Keith came in to see and promote the new systems. But as we were walking in from the front, I don't know if many of you know, there's a triple live Emerson, Lake and Palmer album, which is iconic and important, called Welcome Back, My Friends. And that was recorded here in the Anaheim Convention Center, in the front room. Yeah. And Keith didn't know that.
That album, the Welcome Back My Friends album?
It was recorded right here.
Oh, wow.
The front big room where there's a bit of an arena. ABBA had played there, and the Osmond Brothers and Carpenters, and then ELP recorded in that big oval room out in the front of this place.
Brian, do you have a specific story about Keith going to the house of one of the lucky owners of one of these 5 modulars?
Yeah, the Moog concept was to make a few of these Moog Keith Emerson systems. We called it the EMMS, Emerson Moog Modular System. Very expensive, so very few people could afford them. But the deal was, you give them all this money, they'll build exactly that, and Keith will play it and sign it for you. And the day that this certain one was due, I think the second one they made, Keith was very ill with the flu and couldn't come. And there were deadlines to be fulfilled and it had to be done. So we called the man and said, he lived in San Diego actually, this guy, and said, do you mind if Keith comes to your house to play it and sign it? No, they did not mind. So they set up a thing and they said, could we have a few people over? And Keith said, well, I don't want it to be a big deal. And they said, just a couple neighbors and a friend and our kids. And these people were very nice, and they had a music room in their garage with drum set and pianos and Mellotron and Mini Moog and the Keith Emerson Moog modular that we built. Keith and Mari came down with me, and we went down and spent the day with them, drinking wine, eating crackers, and Keith jammed with everybody. Hey, somebody get on the bass. Let's play some songs. And everybody jammed together, and sometimes he just hung out with them. It was super cool, and this family was so excited.
I bet. So we are going to open the room up for questions. So if you have questions and want to approach the microphone, while you're getting in line to do that, I would just like to add a little note about what Keith meant to Bob. Musicians were Bob Moog's beacon. And he learned so much from them, and often said that the reason he did his work was not to indulge in what he would call, what he referred to drawing schematics as a nerdish form of golf. So that wasn't necessarily his passion, but his passion was to interact with musicians. And there were several musicians along the way that helped him understand what his instruments could do. I don't think that Bob, he would say, he didn't really have any idea in the very early days of all the ways that his instruments could be used. And Keith Emerson was a big part of illuminating how the modular could be used in rock performance. And if you watch the Moog documentary, he talks about the first time he heard Lucky Man, and he knew that song was, going to change a lot of thinking about how the modular could be used. So just wanted to put that little plug in about how important Keith was to Bob, and of course they then enjoyed a lifelong friendship. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Michael Gill, and I think I'm one of a lot of people in the room for whom Keith really changed the trajectory of my life. I first heard ELP as a 13-year-old. First, I want to thank all of you for this panel. It's spectacular. There's a magic to the music of ELP, and I want to know how Greg and Carl fit into that, because it was, as great as Keith was, the music is this melding of two people, and I'd love to get your comments on that, please. Thank you so much.
You know, I think that this is maybe the first supergroup. I guess that's arguable, but they were already known from their different groups, from King Crimson, Arthur Brown, and things like that. So Keith was from the Nice. So they had put together a group of some of the best musicians, handpicked to be together. But I think some people, Greg Lake's singing and playing bass, writing very important songs, while not showing off as much. And he really was a guitar player. When he did play guitar, he was quite good, but he's also the producer of a lot of things they do. So his control of what they got to do and what they presented themselves as was very important. Carl was in the similar arms race as Keith, having a giant drum set. And I'm told at one point that Greg had a very important rug put out to make sure. He would have expensive things on stage too. Big fancy Indian rug.
Yeah. During rehearsals at Miami, they were doing a run through, and Craig walked up to the microphone and got shot. He threw his bass guitar at the roadie. He was so pissed. So, so we put a rug down as an insulator, and the roadie always had to check between the bass guitar and the microphone. No shocks. But he threw it at him.
Next question.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask anybody that knows about this up there, probably you know about it, is I think one of the most interesting pieces is Toccata. And I just wanted to know what you know about how he's getting so many different effects and that kind of thing in that song.
I want to know this too.
I have no idea how he got those sounds.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable what he did. And he did it live. Live, exactly how it was on the record, jumping from one complex modular sound. It would have taken me 3 days to do each sound, and he's jumping from one to the next. I know he had some kind of preset system.
Rachel got it. Rachel can do it.
Yeah. I got to hear the version on Welcome Back My Friends, and I was like, wait, they're doing that live? That's crazy.
Very quick techie version, because that's what you're after, is there's a song called the Hoedown where you hit a key and it glides up. That same modification that allows that to happen on one song is sort of modified because you're putting an LFO that is that kind of octave trill sliding in two different directions at the same time, which involves a splitting and a reversing something. So it is a pretty complicated thing, and I've never heard anyone get it right. Even I don't know exactly how to get it there, but there's a guy in England who has a YouTube video. Look it up, and you'll pretty much get close to the answer.
You're also there was that question about the role that Greg Lake and Carl Palmer had with the music, and it's interesting going back and listening to Keith Emerson when he was in the Nice, because he was an amazing keyboard player and he wrote these pretty cool adaptations of songs, even some of the original material. But then Keith, I don't know if Keith really understood that each singer is not going to have the same vocal range, so that when Greg Lake was a part of Keith's music, I think that Keith began to realize that when Keith composed Tarkus, he wanted it to be an instrumental at first, and Greg Lake had different ideas about it, and so then finally Greg Lake said, "Okay, I'll come up with something," and so it's that mixture of the instrumental wildness of the music that Keith brought, and then Greg says, "Okay, here comes my part for me to sing as a vocalist," and it's wild because when I listen to the live Carnival 9, like the original is in a really high key for a singer. Golden misty morning, I heard a one born in the air. Like, so then when they played it live, they had to lower it. Golden misty morning, I heard a warning born in the air. So I think that with that, it was like, okay, so a singer actually has to make sure that they're going to sing in a key that they're going to feel comfortable in. So it's pretty funny. But I was lucky to have known Greg also, and he was pretty cool. And then Carl Palmer with the classical background, and like on Toccata, both Keith and Carl explored crazy sequencers with their drum machines and Moog synthesizers, and yeah, it's wild.
It's great. Next.
Hi. Well, I have tons of Keith-related stories. Discovering him back in junior high school, brain cell surgery, I was way too young to be understanding it. But one thing I just want to mention, following up on what Steve mentioned of meeting your idols, Keith was always an idol of mine, and building synthesizers and playing and listening, going my first concert ever. But I was so lucky after I moved to California, I had heard that he would sit in sometimes at this place called Typhoon at the Santa Monica airport. And I went one night, it was Halloween, to see him, and saw him playing there, and I was so excited and had camera with me back before iPhones. And just as it ended and I got a chance to talk to him, my battery was dead. So I couldn't take any pictures, so I'm driving back home to Orange County and thinking this is so crazy, it's laughable. And I looked up and found the person who ran his website, and I emailed that person. And the next day, Keith called me and said, oh, well, let's get to dinner, some dinner. So the next week, my wife and I went down to Santa Monica and met Keith and Mari for dinner, and he was just so nice and so friendly, and it was just so wonderful. And I have some other stories, thankfully, of other times I got to meet him. And he was just, you know, like you say, sometimes people, you don't want to meet your idol, but he was everything as a musician I had thought, and as a person was just wonderful.
Thank you.
You remember the time that you took us to the Duramel concert? That was really nice.
Yes, that's another story.
So we just have a few minutes. I think we have time for one more question.
Mine's very random, but it's very nice to see you guys, Fernando, and playing Tarkus with Rachel Flowers at Progstock. That was the hardest piece of music I've ever played in my entire life, and it was very daunting. And Keith was such a genius, and it's just amazing that the innovation that your father had, along with the innovation that Keith happened at the same time. So I always say, you know, it's great that the generations just happen to match. My question's so geeky, it's not even funny. Where's the Constellation today? Where's the Apollo? Where's the original Taurus?
It lives at the National Music Center of Canada in Calgary.
Does it work?
I don't know. Probably. I know they have a good tech there, and they take very good care of their instruments.
So it's amazing that he took that, you know, prototype away, but somebody
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question.
Was that Fernando?
Hi, it's not actually a question. I just wanted to share with you a little bit of my experience of working with Keith on the Emerson, Lake and Powell record. I was asked to go and see Keith because does everyone know about what you get when you interface a GX1 with a tractor?
No idea.
A tractor lost control passing Keith's barn in Sussex, plowed through the wall and crashed not into the cheap stuff, into the GX1. And the GX1 worked fine, but it could never be moved again because it had cracked the casing. And I was asked to go and see him because they wanted to use a lot of the sounds that he was getting from that in the recording studio, but they couldn't move the GX1 there. So, long story short, I found a bunch of ways of doing it. But Keith would not go on tour with that. And in the end, I found out that John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin was thinking of selling his GX1. And I got on the phone with him, and we negotiated for Keith to buy the second GX1 that could actually go on tour. So that was one key thing. The other key thing was that,
We're almost out of time,
yeah,
just so you know.
last story. Keith wanted to get into sampling, and I was working for Jeff Downs. I took Jeff's Emulator 2 down to Sussex, and Keith had a very different idea of what sampling might be. He had me crawling on my knees in his hen house, sampling his chickens. And when he didn't like the results of that, he said, okay, let's get the Kawasaki 1000 motorbike. And I had to sample that. And then he was very disappointed to find he couldn't do a synthesizer solo. So I don't think he ever really got into sampling because he couldn't play it once he'd sampled it. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you people. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, that concludes our time. I feel like we could sit here and talk about Keith Emerson all day long. I just want to thank all of our panelists. Thank the TEC Tracks for having us.
And I just want to thank Michelle. Michelle's been my inspiration on how to carry on the legacy. And she taught me a lot. And thank you for doing this event, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you. And if I can just say before everybody leaves that this panel was produced by the Bob Moog Foundation. And if you haven't been to our booth yet, please come see us. We have the modular, and you can come and see it and play it. And I would ask you to remember the Bob Moog Foundation when you are doing your charitable giving. Please support our work. Do not take for granted that we will always be here. Our work is funded by people like you, and we will always need your support. So thank you again for being here.